Aloha, and thanks for having me today. Really a fun opportunity to come to a place like this. I was here a few years ago before I started my graduate work, and it was probably one of my favorite places on the island. It was really thrilling for me. I'm not a marine biologist per se, but as a naturalist, it's pretty thrilling to be in a place that has this incredible diversity. So my name's Charles. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Tufts University. My research in ecology and conservation biology focuses on wetland ecosystems and the wildlife that depends on them. So I'm really fascinated by wetlands. Hopefully you guys will be too by the end of this talk. And one of my big goals as a researcher is finding ways to better understand these systems and try to align the things that they do for us with the things that they do for endangered wildlife, trying to find ways where we can mutually benefit. I'll be talking about that a little bit too. One thing that I'm really hoping to establish at the beginning of my talk here is returning to the theme of connections. I was watching Dr. Hickson's talk from last week. He talked about everything's connected, right? And so there are two main ways, sort of manifestations of the theme of connectivity that I'd like to discuss with you guys. The first one being the connection between the land and the freshwater with the marine systems. And the second one being connectivity as a concept with how we manage landscapes and protect wildlife. I'll get more into that later. So just to rewind, I wanted to start really at the basics here. Talk about what are wetlands. We're sitting here next to a coral reef, which some people consider wetlands, some people don't. There's often a lot of argument about what counts as wetlands. And I'm trying to cast as wide a net here as possible and say wetlands, what we're talking about, are anywhere where land is meeting water. So we're talking about our interface ecosystems, right? We're talking about anywhere where we see these two things coming together. And there are a lot of really interesting and unique sort of processes and characteristics that come with this that I'm going to be talking about sort of as we move on. And in general, I'd like to establish 3 facts for people to remember about wetlands. One, that they're very unique and they're very different from a lot of other ecological systems you'll encounter. 2, they're tremendously important and they actually do a lot for human beings. They have great value, which is always worth keeping in mind. And 3rd, that they're very threatened. They're very, very sensitive ecosystems. They're threatened by all sorts of different human activities on different levels, and so that makes them kind of in peril compared to a lot of other systems. They oftentimes are under a lot more threat. Wetlands have a pretty bad rap in our society, and this is something I run into a lot. For example, I'll be sitting on an airplane and someone will come over and sit next to me and say, "Oh, what do you do?" I'll say, "Oh, I study birds in wetlands," and they get me to look like I'm crazy, or they start to lean away like I might smell bad. We think of wetlands as places that smell terrible, that are filled with death, that are nasty and disgusting and muddy. And I assure you that though they are muddy, they are none of these things, and they're really fantastic. So of course, in our culture, we have this very well-established idea that wetlands are awful, right? That monsters come out of them, or for example, looking at The Princess Bride, which some people here might have seen, right? The fire swamps, there are evil giant rodents in the swamp. It's just a bad place to be. There's actually a very famous trading card game called Magic. And I have seen that the manifestation of evil energy in this magic universe is a swamp. So wetlands are considered super evil, and they're correlated with death. I don't know what kind of wetland that's supposed to be there. There's all sorts of dead stuff in it. Not what it looks like in real life. We're dealing with something very, very different. What we're dealing with really are absolutely fantastic ecosystems that have a lot of characteristics very, very different from what we tend to run into in the ocean or elsewhere on land. Wetlands are tremendously, tremendously productive. On the EPA's website, they talk about them being sort of a stockpile for food and resources for other organisms. Lots of terrestrial and marine organisms come from both extremes to this interface to get food, to find shelter, things like that. They're really, really amazingly productive ecosystems. A lot of time, the biomass that they produce per unit sunlight rivals tropical rainforests. It's really incredible what they can do. When we're bringing this aquatic environment and this terrestrial environment together, we also get a lot of unique things going on. We get wildlife that are capable of taking advantage of both situations. So this cute little thing in the lower right corner is a water shrew. This is an organism that has adapted to be able to swim very effectively, but also hide in holes in the ground. Dragonflies, as you may know, this dragonfly in the upper right corner is a native Hawaiian endemic species of dragonfly. These are also species that spend part of their life outside, part of their life inside. And you see that a lot with wetlands, that they're using the organisms are uniquely adapted to take advantage of this situation. The third thing we get are geochemical processes. And before people start falling asleep, I won't get into this too much, but what we're dealing with is essentially areas that have oxygen, which are the ones up on land, and areas that do not have oxygen, which are the ones underwater, generally. And when you have those two in very close proximity, a whole bunch of very different metabolic processes performed by microbes can happen very rapidly in succession next to each other. That makes wetlands into chemical factories that can perform a lot of functions that no other ecosystems on the planet can, which actually makes them play a tremendous role in carbon cycles, nitrogen cycles, phosphorus cycles, keeping our environment going. And as we'll learn later on, it also does a lot for people, as you can imagine. With the sort of chemicals and pollutants that we're putting into the environment, wetlands are uniquely situated to take care of those and treat those, which has some pretty strong effects for us. They're very valuable. As we begin to pay more attention to wetlands and understand the ways that they benefit us, one thing that's really interesting is that people have known this for a long time. Wetlands are famous. They're the only ecosystem in the world that has its own international convention. It's called the Ramsar Convention. It was signed in 1971 in a city called Ramsar in Iran. And the goal of this convention is to value and protect wetlands of international importance throughout the world. Hawaii does have its own Ramsar wetland, which is Kawainui Marsh in Kailua, which is a very large wetland, probably the largest freshwater wetland on the island. And wetlands are tremendously, tremendously valuable for these services that I'm going to start talking to you about. The term ecosystem service comes from the early 21st century. It's the idea of understanding and quantifying the things that ecosystems do for us and putting a dollar sign on them. What do they do? How do they benefit us? Which is something a lot of people tend to ask, in sort of a neoliberal society, when everyone's trying to make money or whatever. If we want to protect a forest, we have to say, okay, well, why is this valuable? And that's something we've been doing. A recent estimate of the value of wetlands throughout the planet, the yearly value of the benefits they provide is $4.8 trillion per year. So there's a tremendous amount of value there. And there are a lot of ways that this value is derived. These wetlands are doing a number of things. They're influencing our hydrological cycle. They purify water that's running off from agricultural areas, urban areas, etc. They help water get into the ground. If it's coming down as rain, they help it infiltrate into the groundwater, which in a place like a tropical island like Hawaii, that's tremendously important because that's how we get the majority of our water. They protect coastlines. Coastal wetlands can do a lot to absorb storm surge and prevent erosion. And they also help to regulate the release of water from river systems and things like that. So they prevent flooding inland also if there are huge rain events and things like that. So they're performing a lot of these functions just by dint of existing, and these functions are tremendously valuable for us as people. And that's something we're beginning to become aware of. The third thing, wetlands are vulnerable. They're in a lot of trouble in general. They're considered the most threatened terrestrial ecosystem in the world. Mainly this is because, of course, they're threatened by both marine, aquatic, and terrestrial threats. A forest just has to worry about people developing the land. A lake might have to worry about people damming a river. Wetland has to worry about all of these. It's being influenced by both of these systems. Species that rely on wetlands are 5 times more likely to be on the endangered species list in the United States. I'm sure this holds true throughout the world. And losses have been really, really immense throughout the world. Historically, more in what we might call the developed countries throughout Western Europe and North America. However, now, of course, this sort of devastation of wetland habitats is spreading throughout the world. One of the ones that's very easily highlighted is the Yellow Sea right now, where a number of nations are absolutely destroying huge amounts of wetland habitat. And that's not only hurting those nations themselves as they lose some of these ecosystem services, but of course it's hurting the wildlife. So here we can see a pretty large population of shorebirds that's in the process of overwintering during their migration on a flat in southern China, and the wetland is being actively filled in behind them, and their habitat is slowly closing in around them. And of course, they're eventually going to have nowhere to go as that continues. So it's worth knowing. Wetlands are unique, wetlands are important, and they're threatened, sort of by dint of that uniqueness. So Hawaiian wetlands, to sort of bring this story home a little bit. The wetlands that I'm interested in Hawaii, and sort of the primary type of wetland here that we encounter, are freshwater coastal wetlands. So they're found in sort of the low areas on the outside of the islands, and they're typically fed either by small flashy streams coming down from the mountains, or actually by underwater springs, because a lot of this water is percolating from the mountains directly through these volcanic dikes into the groundwater, and so much pressure comes that they burble up along the coastline, and then we would get all these freshwater wetlands. And like elsewhere in the world, the freshwater wetlands in Hawaii are very threatened. And one reason you might imagine for this is that they are always placed exactly where humans want to be. They're in places with a view of the ocean, they're in places with lots of fresh water, and they're in places that are very flat and easy to build on. So they typically get just totally bulldozed, and that's something we've been seeing. And these wetlands are performing services. Again, because we're on a small island, we're on an urban island, we're on an island with a tremendous number of people, with a tremendous number of needs, we need to pay attention to the services that these wetlands can provide. And they are providing a lot in very different contexts than they might be elsewhere in the world. Yes, they are protecting from floods and things like that, but probably the major function that they're performing is influencing our groundwater and our runoff. And I'm going to start, this is where we start to connect things to what we've got out there, this beautiful bay outside and all these coral reef systems. As the water falls down on any body of land, it either goes into the ground or over the surface. Just typical hydrology. Now, as we continue to develop landscapes and we get these huge stretches of urban land, that water usually runs straight into the ocean. Wetlands, meanwhile, help kind of act like a sponge, soak in a lot of that water, and give it a controlled, slow entrance into the groundwater where then we can have access to it. In the process of doing that, it actually cleans that water. We talked about the interesting molecular processes that are going on in these wetlands that don't happen anywhere else. Wetlands have this unique ability to clean the water that they absorb, and as it reaches the groundwater, it's been, the pesticides have been removed, and the fertilizers have been removed, and these heavy metals have been sequestered deep in the soil where they can't affect anyone. This is a really amazing filtration system that actually people are starting to take advantage of this all over the world. In Hawaii, presumably there's been no actual research done on it yet, but it's the same processes are applying here. As we continue to develop the landscape, we're shifting the balance from water getting into the groundwater to water going into the ocean. So we're getting less water to start with. We're also getting less clean water because a lot of this water is coming right off the streets where it's soaking up, whatever, exhaust fumes or dripped oil from cars, and that's all going directly into the ocean. If, on the other hand, as it's going across the landscape, even if it's not underground, if it passes through a wetland, again, it has to pass through this sort of gauntlet of chemical processes that remove and help settle out the siltation, the dirt, help settle out all these unwanted characteristics of the water so that cleaner water is going into our oceans, even if it's not getting to us. You can imagine this also has pretty big effects on our coral reefs. On the left here, we have an image of a sewer drain that I took in Waipahu next to a martial arts school that I train at, and I saw it and thought, this is exactly the point I'm trying to make. When the rain comes down, it floods the landscape, where does it go? They put it right there on the drain. Very important to know, straight into the ocean. And of course, a lot of the sort of old school water management on the island consists of these drainage dikes, where the problem on Hawaii, of course, is that with the way that we're developing the land, sometimes it rains so darn hard, we have no idea what to do with that water, and we're trying to get rid of it as fast as we can. So we put it in a chute, and we knock it out to sea. What are those things usually filled with? Old tires, trash, you name it. All of that is going right into our ocean. So of course, then we get situations like this. We can't swim because the water's too dirty, or the coral reefs are getting covered in silt, or they're getting sick from whatever other chemicals we're putting in the water. This is something that wetlands naturally can prevent, and it's something that we're not taking advantage of those uses right now. The evidence for this is tremendous. I'm just doing a few short searches on academic journals. I came up with a tremendous amount of papers talking about siltation and other land-based pollution that destroys coral reefs, all of which could presumably be addressed through wetlands. These things that wetlands used to do. They used to prevent this from happening. And of course, if we have more of these wetlands, presumably, then we can have more of this. And so there's a very strong connection. Even if you don't care in the slightest about weird red-faced birds that I like to study that are running around in the wetlands of the island, it's important to care about these wetlands for what they can do to our coastal system. So fish people should also love wetlands for a number of other reasons too, but this is the major connection that I'd like to impress on you today, that what's going on out there right now in this reef has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about with these endangered birds in their habitats. So one of the things that a lot of people ask me is, where are the wetlands on the island and where do they used to be? And this is how my PhD started, actually, is I was doing work in a number of geographical information programs trying to figure out where wetlands would have been if all this development, all these cities weren't here. And so my advisor and I developed a model using a combination of hydrological modeling and also soil data and current wetland distributions to try to simulate and estimate where wetlands used to be on the island. You notice some of these are up really high. Those wetlands are actually just moist soil areas that some people would classify as wetlands. But the stuff around the coast is what we're really worried about. And this is what our most conservative model kind of came out with, is that there was a tremendous amount of wetland habitat in the area being fed again by all this rain coming down in the mountains, which really does a lot to feed these areas. And then we compared that, of course, to what we have now. So the next map is the wetland distribution as of 2010. And you can see there's been quite a bit of loss. And what we estimated, sort of trying to be as conservative and generous as possible, was that of these coastal low elevation wetlands on Oahu, about 75% have been lost. So you can see there's been a major reduction of habitat. So of course, as a conservation biologist, my next question was, how does this affect the water birds? And I was tremendously interested in studying these water birds. My advisor has been studying them for about 25 years. And he said, you need to study this bird right here. And he showed me a funny picture of this strange looking animal. And I was staring at it in disbelief, trying to understand what I was getting myself into. This is the ʻalae, or Hawaiian gallinule. It's one of several endemic water birds that are found on these islands. These birds are a subspecies of a very widely spread species known as the common gallinule. They're also closely related to common moorhen, which now has been split taxonomically, and they're now over in Europe and Africa as considered a separate species. So these birds are specialists on these freshwater coastal wetlands. They absolutely need them to survive. I'll be talking a little bit about their habitat requirements as we go on. They are very, very cryptic, sneaky birds. They're very, very hard to see unless they've started to adapt to people. They eat a lot of different foods. I've seen them eat everything from edamame to Cheetos to snails. They're very, very adaptable, and we can talk about that as we go on. But as a subspecies, as one of the endemic water birds in Hawaii, we know the least about this species of all the ones we have here on Oahu, which is really interesting. And partially that's just because their behaviors. They're so cryptic, they're so shy, they're so difficult to see. And of course, it's worth mentioning that this is, of course, totally jiving with the cultural understanding of the ʻalae ʻula in Hawaiian culture, which has always been seen as this sort of sneaky creature that stole fire from the goddess Pele, and it was so tricky and shy that Maui had to trick the bird and choke the secret of fire out of it. Right? It has a lot of importance in the lore, but you can see that the native Hawaiian people, of course, were making the same behavioral observations that we are. This is a very interesting looking bird. They're very beautiful, but they're sneaky and clever, and they're very hard to understand and hard to track. This is something that I've been learning the hard way as my research continues. So here on this map, the inky black marks that I put all over it are all the areas that we currently know or estimate that there's some population of ʻalae ʻula or Hawaiian gallinules there. And what I see as a landscape ecologist when I look at this map is what's known as habitat fragmentation. What we're seeing are that, like we saw that earlier map, where there used to be a lot more habitat, now of course there's much less. There are tiny pockets where these birds are being protected and their habitats are available and they're able to live there and they're thriving in those small pockets. The problem is we're worried about those pockets being connected to one another. If they're all separate, they don't have a very good shot of not going extinct. And this covers a very, very large theme in conservation biology and pretty much the main thing that I worry about in my PhD, which is the idea of landscape fragmentation. As we as human beings develop landscapes, as we build highways, as we build cities, as we break things down, not only do we reduce the amount of habitat, which we saw on the first map, we also shift the distribution, right? We cut it apart so there are things that used to be connected which are no longer. And so what we estimate in terms of the effects of these changes in the landscape is based on whether or not we see organisms being able to move between habitats. If two habitats that are apart from one another have individuals of a population moving between them, we call them connected. That's good. That's what we want. If they're not moving, that's something that we might consider a conservation concern. Populations that are small and isolated from one another have a very high risk of going extinct. This can be from inbreeding. It's very easy for them to lose their genetic diversity. Losing their genetic diversity, they can also be much less adaptable to change. So if a disease hits the population, there might not be enough genetic diversity that there are some individuals who are immune to the disease or can get around it. And then beyond that, if you're just unlucky and you're a small isolated population and something goes wrong, that population can just go extinct. If you're connected to some other populations, individuals can leave if something bad happens, if there's a fire, if there's no water for several months. And also new individuals can come in and recolonize and reinforce the population. So that connectivity on the landscape has become really a huge focus of research in my field. And it's something we haven't really thought about until the last 20, 30 years. So again, we're interested in figuring out, okay, well, if we build a road, are the turkeys going to cross it? Are they going to be able to get between these habitats? And that's an interesting question. And in my opinion, an especially nice one because it's an ecological and behavioral question. We have to go study these birds to do it. We can't just sit behind our computers and type in a bunch of numbers and see what happens. We have to go out in the field and chase around a bunch of birds and get dirty. And that is a really cool type of ecology in my mind. So again, connectivity and conservation. This is not the first time anyone's asked these questions, but this is the first time someone's asked these questions in a really in-depth way on Hawaii. So up in Western North America, this has been done with grizzly bears, for example, where people are trying to understand the connection between different habitats, figure out whether these bears are capable of getting between their available habitats and reserves. And we do this, of course, by tracking them however we can. So with the bears, they put radio collars on them and then try to detect them as they move about. So our question is, in developing Oahu, have we created an unfriendly landscape for these birds? Have we fragmented their habitat? And is that going to affect their extinction risk? This is a species that almost went extinct in the 1960s. They used to be found on all of the Hawaiian Islands, and now they're found only on Kauai and Oahu. The population was down to, I think, under 60 individuals at one point, and they've been recovering since then. We're estimating probably about 600 split between the two islands. So we want to know, they're making some recovery, yes. Is that long term? Is this going to last? That's basically the implication of this question. And you can imagine this is kind of a big question. How do you chase around a bird that for hundreds or if not thousands of years, right, people have been saying this bird is really sneaky, right? If Maui couldn't do it, right? I mean, how am I going to, I'm not a demigod. I can't necessarily do this. So there are a number of different approaches I've been using to get at this question. The first is what's called a mark resite study. I'll be talking about this as we move on. This is basically a very basic, simple way for people to understand movement. You mark an individual animal so that you can identify them, and then you try to spot them wherever they are. You keep track of their movement over time. We've been using molecular markers, which again I'll be talking about, and hopefully not boring everyone to death. But this is actually using the DNA, the genome of the individuals, to understand whether or not they're moving between habitats. Radio telemetry is another method we've been using. This is, of course, the really cool techie side where we actually put trackers on these birds. They can't wear collars, but I'll be showing you what we do with that. And very relevant to people here and people listening online is that we're developing a volunteer network. And so we're actually working on having people who are interested in bird watching, interested in participating in science, go out and spot the birds that we've been banded and tell us where they are. And people have been doing this over the last couple of years. The information is tremendously useful. Some of the coolest data we've gotten for this project so far has come from people sending us information. And we're also going to be using that in papers that are getting published over the next couple of years. So it's a really neat way to go out and be a bird nerd and see cool stuff, and then also help science, which is, for me, it doesn't get any cooler than that. So to start with, mark resite techniques. So again, we're taking an organism and we're giving it some way of being identifiable, right? I can't see two butterflies and be like, oh, that's Jerry and that's Sally. I'll never know. There's just no way. So people, for example, will catch butterflies and draw numbers on them, things like that. You release them, and then you go around catching butterflies and see where you catch them again. If you catch them at different places, presumably they moved. Barring maybe somebody with a golf cart grabbing your butterfly and zipping off somewhere else and leaving it there. Assuming that doesn't happen, you've got movement going on. So you mark them, then you look for them, and then you record the locations across time. Very, very simple. People have been doing this for a really, really long time. Looking for them, writing down on the map. And this is just sort of the general workflow. And this is something that takes a long time because, of course, these birds are hard to detect. This is what we've been working on. Just to give you an idea of what this looks like with the birds, we catch them in what are called live or have-a-heart traps. These are what people tend to use to remove cats from their property. Just a small cage. We put some attractive food item at the back. Eventually, the gallinules get really hungry and they decide to run in there. They get stuck. We take them out. We take a number of physiological measurements, and then we put these colored leg bands on them. And these leg bands tell us exactly where the individual is. So every individual has a 4-letter code that comes from their 4 color bands with a 1-letter abbreviation. Then we have to go out and look for these birds. So we have a lot of people sending us pictures when they see banded birds, which is really exciting. We can use that information. And we spend a lot of our time just trying to recite these birds wherever they are. The molecular markers are probably one of the coolest bits of science that I've had the opportunity to do during my PhD. what we're essentially working with are specific regions of the genome of the bird that don't do anything, that have absolutely no use. They are like legitimately useless stretches of DNA, don't do anything. And the reason we like that so much is because regions of DNA that do something nice, that do something beneficial for the bird, that have some function, as soon as they mutate and something gets different about them, they don't get passed on to the next generation. Something goes wrong. It can affect the animal, right? And they can die and not pass on their genes. We want to be able to estimate how often these things are becoming mutated and use that as a molecular clock. So the machinery that replicates our DNA makes typos. It's not perfect. It does something wrong every now and then. And what we're interested in is being able to predict how often that's going to happen. So if we look at the same place of the genome of two different birds on average from two populations, based on how different they are, we can estimate how much movement is going on between those populations. Generally, these birds are not moving for no reason. Generally, they're moving to find a mate. And so those genes are moving with them. And that's the big thing we're trying to see. So we're capturing these birds and taking feather samples and then taking the DNA out of the feathers and analyzing them between populations. And that's a good way to estimate movement. The nice thing, of course, is that we don't have to go looking around for these birds anymore. Once we have that feather sample, we've got the information we need, and we can work with that. And one way we do that is by using this FST metric, which is a ratio that helps you measure, okay, roughly how much connectivity is there here. So looking at my horrible art skills here, on the left, we have two wetlands that are very strongly connected. Those big arrows mean a lot of individuals are moving between those wetlands. That would give you a very low FST value. The higher the FST value, the more separation, the more structure you see between those two habitats, which implies we're not getting the movement that we might expect. So then I end up putting on a lab coat, spending a lot of time in the laboratory, feeling like a real scientist. The picture on the upper right is one of my favorites because that's an entire 3 months of field work reduced to a single plate. And it kind of was a little embarrassing to see it that way. But so the next thing that we do, again, trying to get around this problem of sighting the birds because they're so hard to get a hold of, they're so hard to see in the first place, is when we catch them, we'd like to find some way to detect them again without having to go out and be in the wetlands all the time. And radio telemetry is an excellent solution to this. So you take an animal, you put some sort of a transmitter on it, and then you can find them with an antenna. The fun thing is you can automate this process. And so one thing that I've been working on with my colleagues with USGS, Evan Paxton and Martha Kawasaki, is that they're designing towers that we can put around the island that are constantly scanning for us. So I don't have to be out there every day like looking at this little thing and holding an antenna back and forth, which could be tremendously laborious, and we could miss things. Instead, we have these sentry towers that are always up. And if a bird shows up in a wetland, they will pick it up immediately and say, hey, bird number 68 showed up here, just so you know. And that's really useful information for us. So here are a couple pictures of what it looks like as we do it in the field. So on the left is one of our Sigma 8 transmitters with a harness on it. We custom fit that to the bird as a sort of backpack. And there's a bird very proudly wearing its contribution to science there. There's been a lot of work done on these sort of transmitters and whether or not they affect the birds and things like that. And we really stick to the established literature in terms of how we apply them to the bird, how we minimally affect their behavior, and really make this as safe as possible for the bird. So you can see the green part in the middle there on the left of the transmitter harness. That's actually a stretch of rubber band that will eventually break off and release from the bird. Or, for example, if it gets caught on something, it'll snap off and the bird is free to go and not stuck. So we have a lot of precautions to make sure we're seeing natural behaviors here. And then on the right, you can see these towers that we're putting up around the island. And these are, of course, just gold mines of data and telling us all the time, oh, this bird's here, this bird's here, this bird's here. And maybe someday it'll say, oh, this bird's not here. And then one across the island will say, oh, this bird's here now. And that's, of course, precisely the information we're going for. So what's come of all this? My last zany 3 years coming to the island every summer. These numbers, whenever I'm presenting during the summer, these numbers are always obsolete because we're constantly catching birds. We caught 2 this morning and put out a new transmitter this morning down at Pearl Harbor. So the data are still coming in. But we've banded so far something like 230 individual birds on the island. Again, thinking about the total population in the world, we've really got a pretty nice sample here. We keep track of a lot of individual birds. We have well over 100 feather samples now from 11 to 12 different wetlands on the island, which again, that's representing a significant portion of the wetlands on the island. So we think we're really getting as close to the whole picture as we're going to get right now. And again, these data are still coming, which is pretty exciting. So we have this database that is probably about over 1,500 resightings right now, both from volunteers sending information in to us, which is always great because usually they come with a selfie with the bird and things like that. And also, of course, our own resightings and some stuff that historically from people who banded birds before me. In all this time so far, we have 2 confirmed movements ever. The first one was actually before I started my graduate work. This was the movement that was the reason I got sent down here pretty much, was that my predecessor banded a bird in Kahuku at the James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge, and it showed up in Pearl Harbor a couple of years later, and everyone was thinking, whoa, we didn't even know these birds could fly, right? This is really something. So my advisor said, Charles, get down there. I said, okay, sure, can do. And then last year, from a volunteer, we got news that a bird had moved from Ke'awa'awa wetland, which is a really important small wetland down near the urban center of Oahu in Hawaii Kai. That bird was a young bird, left and went up to Enchanted Lakes. We saw him this year. We're pretty sure he's found a girlfriend up there. Everything's going well. But again, this is the type of movements we're interested in seeing. And these are birds that are crossing not, non-trivial amounts of land, and they're crossing highways, they're crossing mountains. I mean, these are odysseys that are going on, and we don't know how the heck they're doing it. And that, of course, is going to be tremendously important for us to understand, well, if we don't see enough movement, how can we improve that movement? How can we make them move more? Do we need to have little ponds next to the highways so they can land and rest for a second and keep going? We don't know. And unless we get more information, we're not going to have a good idea. Genetics. Please ignore these numbers. Don't get too into it. But look at the red boxes. Those are very important. I'm going to split this up because we looked at our 2 different molecular markers, 2 different areas of the genome of the organism. The first set are called microsatellites. These are areas where the genetic code, right, which is those 4 letters, A, T, G, C, they're areas where you just see the same 2 letters over and over and over again for a really long time. So the poor molecular machines that are replicating your DNA are sitting there like A, T, A, T, A, T, and they're like, getting drowsy and like, oh my gosh, what is this? These are areas that very rapidly tend to mutate because mistakes always get made there. Apparently, even a molecular machine can't do AT, 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 AT 1,000 times without messing something up. Maybe putting an extra one on, maybe dropping one off. But we see mistakes here very often. Again, they don't do anything, so we don't see any effect on the animals, and these mutations get passed on to the next generation. This happens very rapidly. So this is a very short-term look at connectivity on the island. So what we have in this matrix here are 7 wetlands that I was able to have good sample sizes for last year. And every square are 2 wetlands and whether or not they're connected to one another. Obviously, the diagonal is the wetland to the wetland, so that's a meaningless statistic. And what we're seeing are, in these red boxes, a lot of very high FST values, right? They're significantly high, which means we're seeing a difference between these populations that we can detect very clearly. It means that there might not be so much movement going on there. Interestingly enough, if you look at JCNR and TURT, Turtle Bay, that's James Campbell and Turtle Bay. Those wetlands are right next to each other. There's nothing but a small chain link fence between them, and we're seeing a difference in the populations. Pretty interesting stuff that we're getting these levels of differentiation. The second marker we use is mitochondrial DNA, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, you only get it from your mom. So we can look at differences, for example, of whether, okay, are only females moving or only males moving by looking at the difference with this statistic. Additionally, mitochondrial DNA mutates more slowly. It's not quite as typo prone as the other one. And so it gives us a longer term perspective. And we see slightly less of this fragmentation, slightly less fewer red boxes here, but we're still seeing it. So it looks like if there is this fragmentation, it might be more persistent than we imagine and not just a super recent thing. Another thing we can do is take these numbers that we got and look at whether or not they're correlating with distance. Are the wetlands that are further apart more different than the ones that are close by? And to sum up these horrible graphs in one word, no. We just don't see any real relationship. There's something else going on here. Which again, for me as a behavioral ecologist, I like to go outside and chase birds around and see what they're doing. This is fascinating. Why doesn't the distance make a difference? Is there something else that's preventing them from moving or encouraging them from moving? This is the kind of stuff we're hoping to look into. And seeing this for me is tremendously exciting. It's raising a lot more questions than it's answering, but I think that's science in general. One last thing we can do, and look at some pretty colors, is run some fancy statistical algorithms that try to group birds based on their genes at these different areas on the genome. So what we're looking at here are 3 colors. red, blue, and green, which represent 3 totally arbitrary groups. We told the computer, hey, these are the genes of these birds. Why don't you put each one in a group for us? Group them. And it tried to do so. And so every vertical line of a certain set of colors is one individual bird that we sampled last year. And the colors are how often the computer put it in one of those 3 categories. The black lines I inserted myself. Those separate different wetlands from each other. What we can see is that each wetland seems to have its own little profile, and they're different from each other. And this is what we call genetic structure. We're seeing that if we gave this computer a bird from a wetland, it could probably tell us where it came from. That means there's not as much interbreeding as we're hoping to see. That means we might have fragmentation of this population, which is interesting. So what are our tentative conclusions here? We're seeing very few movements visually. We're not getting a lot when we're trying to recite these birds. We've only had a couple people report them. And then, you know, when I come to the island with my assistants and all my colleagues, we go around, we look really hard for birds. We're still not seeing any that have moved. So it's pretty striking. And the genetic data seem to be backing this up. The genetic data are also showing, hey, well, you know, these populations are looking a little different from each other. There might be something going on. So the big question is, are we dealing with fragmentation? And that's the question that we're really trying to get at as we move forward, especially as we start to get these telemetry data back, which are right now still sort of in the process of getting started. So my PhD, I think, is gradually going to become a case of understanding why didn't the gallinule cross the road? And there are a lot of ways of, you know, there are a lot of possibilities. And we're not going to know until we have more time to look at these birds and understand what they're doing. It could be that that different types of habitat appeal to them and other kinds don't. And so they might only move to habitats they like, and they might be avoiding ones that don't. That might be biasing things differently than just distance. It could have something to do with what they call the landscape matrix. This is the idea of what kind of stuff do they have to move over? Do they have to cross an Air Force bombing range to get to the next wetland? Or do they have to cross a chain link fence, which apparently for them is really bad? I don't know. So how permeable that matrix is, whether or not they can move through that landscape, is a question we really need to get at. And again, that might be part of the issue. Maybe they can only move along rivers. So the wetlands that have rivers near them are going to be more connected. We haven't done those analyses yet, and that's what I'm hoping to get to in the next couple of years. So what's coming next for this study? The big thing, of course, is really pushing this radio telemetry. I think it's a tremendous asset to our project to be able to just detect these birds wherever they go. It's a lot better than trying to see them, because as I've said, they're really sneaky. The problem, of course, is there are all sorts of costs involved, and it's tremendously difficult to raise the funds to get these towers up. But we're working through that right now, and unfortunately, we've had issues with vandalism and theft. So recently, we had a tower up at a ridge near Kailua between 2 of the large wetlands there, and it was completely vandalized and all the expensive equipment stolen. And of course, now we've lost tremendous amounts of data, and every day birds could be moving and we don't know. And so it's really tough that way. And that kind of hamstrings some of our research for the summer. But we're hoping as time goes on, we can get more and more of this data. And then, you know, as a bug nerd also, or I should say I'm just a general nerd, but I like bugs a lot. One thing that I'm getting really excited about right now, which is probably the least exciting thing I could possibly think of saying to you guys right now, is ectoparasite genetics. You can all shudder later. The idea being that, well, like we were looking at, the genes of the birds will slowly diverge if they're not moving and breeding between wetlands. Interestingly enough, the same thing happens to their parasites. Is the lice that live on these birds, which is typically just 1 or 2 species that specializes in that particular bird, they have even faster generation times. They're going to get typos accumulating even more rapidly. And so they're actually a higher resolution genetic tool to see, okay, are these populations interacting or not? Even cooler, the birds don't even have to go and mate with anybody to do well. And all they have to do is get too close to somebody, and somebody, you know, or get in a fight, and the parasites are exchanged. So we're hoping to start collecting lice off these birds during the next field season and look at the genetic relations between the lice and, again, get a better idea of what we're seeing here, because there's a possibility, there's all sorts of reasons that the data I'm getting from the birds might be sort of messy. And of course, people are always asking me, well, you know, wow, these birds are and how awesome the wetlands are. What can I do about it? And I think there are a lot of different things people can do. And I have 2 really simple ideas here, and people can get involved as they see fit. But one of the best ones is just talk about wetlands, right? Don't help people get over this fear where we think, oh my gosh, wetlands, so it's malaria and dengue and evil and fire rats and whatever lives in these places, right? They're really cool ecosystems. Go hang out in one, get money. They smell great. They don't really smell great, but they're fantastic. it's important that we start a dialogue of understanding that these things are tremendously important. You know, at my university, I actually interact interdisciplinarily with a lot of people who are in leadership fields, people who are studying politics, people who are going into diplomacy and becoming leaders, and none of them know anything about wetlands. They all think, oh yeah, stinky, gross. I'm like, no, valuable, cha-ching, money. These are things that help people, and we need to pay attention to that. So talk about wetlands. Tell everyone they're great. Don't watch Princess Bride too many times or get fooled by that evil notion. And of course, volunteering is always a great thing to do. So I've been fortunate enough to run into the Livable Hawaii Kai Hui, who work in Honolulu, or the Hawaii Kai area. And they have this wonderful wetland there that they've been fixing up and protecting. And they have wetland cleanups and wetland volunteer days every second Saturday or something like that. And again, every time I come back to work at that wetland, it's totally improved and everything looks better than it did the last time. And it's not because they're paying bajillions of dollars to get some huge ecological consulting firm to come in. It's because really cool people are interested in helping the wetland, and the work they do is amazing. When the first time I came there, they had maybe 5 or 6 birds in the wetland, and they had just acquired some property to the side. And I said, oh, you know, that area would be really nice for the gallinules if it was a little clearer, and you could do this and this with it, put this plant in. I came back the next year, they had done everything, and there was a family of birds breeding there, and they'd already increased the number of birds in the wetland. It's that easy. It's just little tiny changes, probably a couple full days of volunteering, and it was done. And then these birds are coming in, and you're contributing to the population of some animal that there's only 600 left in the world. It's really important. And of course, I've got to push our research, reporting banded birds. If you see them around, please let us know. It's really important that we get the whereabouts of these individuals, and that really helps us a lot. So I've been doing a lot of babbling. Mahalo to you guys for having me here. There are a tremendous number of people who I owe my gratitude for having the project move on. If there's time, I'd love to take questions, but thank you guys for having me. Yes, sir.
Simple, but I've been asking myself all the way through your excellent presentation. Do these birds fly?
So the question is, do they fly? They do. They do. They don't do it very often. So there's a whole paradox here. This is why I'm really glad you asked this question. So they're in the rail family, which interestingly enough is the family of birds that has, as far as I understand it, colonized almost every island in the world. So evolutionarily speaking, they must have been able to fly, because they're usually one of the first bird species to show up somewhere. They just get everywhere. There's fossil evidence now that just across all the different islands in the Pacific, there were something like 2,000 species of endemic rail, because they colonized all these islands and they got stuck there and they became flightless. It's like a repeated pattern throughout evolutionary history. To think about that, there are only probably about 9,000 or 10,000 species of bird in the world today, and there used to be about 2,000 species of just rail hanging out on these islands. It's really amazing. So they got here, right? I mean, they got to Hawaii, and as far as we know, the ancestors of this subspecies are from probably Mexico or Florida or something like that. They came from southern North America. So they must have been historically capable of flying. But we're seeing this pattern evolutionarily of rails reach an island. That's great, dandy, they do great. Their wings disappear, their legs get really muscular, they become flightless, they go the way of the dodo. It's been the repeated thing. These birds are doing exactly that. So I haven't published any of this yet. I've seen some people sort of allude to it in the literature, but I've been taking measurements on these birds as I collect them and band them, let them go. And what we're seeing is, compared to the mainland birds, if I look in books where people have measured them, they have shorter wings, they're fatter, they have bigger legs. They're kind of on their way towards flightlessness, and they don't fly much. We barely ever see them fly. But the ones in the mainland, which have been studied more, they're known to migrate at night. And they probably have a whole different way of flying, because we just see them kind of flutter. They probably go straight up, fly very high, long distance at night when it's safer. And that's what we think these birds are doing, but I've never seen it. So, yes, ma'am.
As a child playing in Hawaii, Washington, ʻula, and in elementary school and high school, we would spend hours on rafts, kayaks, hidden in the bushes, trying to find these birds, and we were so excited that we saw one or two. And now the behavior has changed so much. Behind down to earth. Yeah. You open your car door, they walk over to you, they open their mouth, feed you. I've seen them cross the street with a light and go over to save flight. I mean, it's just amazing. The dangerous change in behavior. Do you think the ʻalae would do the same, or is it something about the adaptability of the ʻula?
We have an expert in the room who could tell us more about that. And so the question was about whether the ʻalae would have the same behavioral flexibility that the ʻalae ʻula has, in terms of its, right, they're typically very shy. If you go some places, they're going to mug you for your Cheetos or whatever. And I would say I don't think the coots are quite as, I see them get more tame, but not quite as tame. And that might have something to do with the fact that they're a little bit less terrestrial than the gallinules, but I might turn that over to Marty. I can repeat her answer to the people online, but maybe hear what Martha has to say about it.
So, your question was, ʻalae would they show this adaptiveness? My experience working with them is they are far more shy than ʻalae ʻula. In fact, they're the hardest ones to catch in a walking trap because new things scare them so much. New things. For me, it takes me about 3 months to catch one bird. And that's because they're so hard to get used to the situation. I have seen them come up behind the down to earth and kailua and eat, but the second they see you, like, shoot their body, they're out of it. So it's going to take them a lot longer than the ʻalae ʻula.
So the general answer was that, yeah, it does seem to be that the ʻalae was a lot shyer. They're definitely more difficult to trap in our experience. What we typically see in the big wetlands is that the ʻalae are more visible because they're on the water and they don't have the same hiding behavior that the ʻalae ʻula are. So in a totally natural environment, they may seem less shy, but they are much less willing to start trusting people. And in a lot of very urban environments, the ʻalae ʻula, of course, I mean, they'll come and bug you until you feed them. You can see that difference. I'm working on some research right now. We're trying to understand whether that range of behavioral responses we're seeing might correlate with some physiological variables. So we're actually looking to see if stress hormone levels differ between birds, say, at down to earth, and birds in the inside of Hamakua Marsh. Because if you go up to the inside, which of course you need permission from DOFA and things like that, but if you go to that side, they're like ghosts. They don't want anything to do with you. You show up at the wetland, you hear somebody go off and make an alarm call, and all the birds are gone. You never see them. And my first time going to down to earth was insane. And they were just, some guy was feeding them donuts, and it took me an hour to catch them all. It was just nothing. But yeah. Sarah,
Do these birds swim in water?
do these birds swim in water? Yes, they do.
Well, they don't show it with their feet.
Yeah, they show it when they swim in water. They're not particularly good at it. You can tell it's a very laborious process from them. They're separate from the coots, and that they're really erring towards the terrestrial side. The reason they like to have water around is more because they like to eat plants and animals that exist in wetlands, and because they like to be able to run away over water. That gives them some defense against predators. So they like to nest where they're surrounded by water that makes them feel safer.
They swim in water.
They can swim in water, and actually they can dive, which is something that I've also discovered very surprisingly this year. Is they can dive and swim pretty rapidly underwater. But on the surface, you can see them kind of straining really hard to swim, whereas the coots are just little ducks and they can just go around. So yeah.
Can you give us an idea of the size?
So the question is about the size of the birds.
Yeah.
So the heaviest bird we've ever captured was 608 grams, which is what, a pound maybe and some change. They're light. They're not. I would say they're maybe a foot tall, maybe a little over a foot and a half, something like that. They're like a small chicken. Yeah, they're a little smaller than most chickens. Yeah, or something. Yeah, and they're kind of more slender. The expression "thin as a rail," right? That actually comes from the bird and not from an actual rail. And that's because their bodies are typically laterally compressed, so they can run rapidly through the reeds and things like that, which these guys still do. So they might, yeah, especially from the side. If you see them straight on, they're pretty svelte that way. Yeah, I have a good picture somewhere, but yeah. So yes, sir.
Given that the habitat is so limited and the population is so small, has anybody thought of captive breeding or expanding the range, that is expanding the another island, helping them establish on another island.
Right. So the question being whether there's been any consideration of trying to reestablish the populations on other islands. And this is always like the first thing people think of as a management technique. And it makes a lot of sense, and it's worked in other species. And like I said, they used to be found on the other Hawaiian islands, so why not put them there? I think it's a number of things, including some very unfortunate things that aren't necessarily that sort of strong in the way they should be preventing people from doing this. But basically, it's been tried before, but translocation is a really difficult process, and it was done sort of lackadaisically and didn't work out well. So was it Molokai so some 15 individuals or something of this species were moved over to Molokai to reestablish, and one guy ate them all. And then of course, that's not DOFA's fault, and that doesn't mean that they wouldn't establish successfully somewhere, but it really kind of scared people a little bit. And it's like, oh geez, like there go 15 of these birds that are so rare, like, ugh. But even beyond that, just looking at the established literature in conservation biology, translocation is really difficult. Especially birds that are as territorial as these guys, they get really stressed out when they move into a new place. And so there are some risks involved. I think in the long term, it's going to be something that Fish and Wildlife, that Hawaii DOFA are interested in doing. I think it is something they're interested in doing. But I think there's a lot of red tape and sort of cultural sort of flinchiness around the idea of translocating now, because the one or two times it's been attempted, it has not worked. But I think certainly for the long-term prognosis of the species, of the subspecies, it's something people have to do. Yeah. Question in the back.
So in the 60s, when it was on the brink of extinction, what was done to reverse the situation? Was it the wetlands cleanups that you described, or what has been done that was really successful?
So what was it that saved the species from the brink of extinction? I would say that the main two things were that one, hunting was banned of the birds because it was totally okay for a while, and they were a game bird, big time. And the second one was that refuges started to be established to protect them. And so they started to have areas that were actively managed. So among their threats were invasive mammals. So the mongoose, dogs, cats, rats, all these things hit them really hard because they weren't necessarily very well adapted. They nest more or less on the ground. And if the dog can swim or whatever, it can get there and cause a problem. So that was really hammering them really hard. And also their habitats were getting overgrown by invasive vegetation. That would ruin the habitat value for them. They couldn't live in it. They couldn't hide well. They couldn't nest well, and it really do them in. And so having refuges set aside enabled people to manage what kind of vegetation was there, to make sure that it was good habitat for them, and to trap and kill mongoose, and to keep dogs out, and to keep cats out. And I think that was the thing that really ended up starting to turn the situation around, is that they rely on a couple really major state and federal wildlife refuges that have big populations. And those populations, I would expect, are probably source populations that are exporting individuals to the smaller populations around the island that are protected by private interests, or even just golf courses, things like that are not even protected, but the birds can persist there. And I think those are what's the real strongholds. And the question is, can we make those strongholds connected to one another? And that's going to be the long-term thing. But the short-term, that's what saved them. One more question. Yeah, in the back there. Yeah.
Really quickly, I might have missed it, but I wanted to know how to report the bird if you see it.
Sure. Let's see if I have that slide up. Aha! Perfect. Like I planted you in the audience. So there are a couple different ways. You can email me directly if you'd like to just kind of correspond and chat about what you were seeing. We have a website, which is the second one down, the project website, where there's a guide on.
Sorry, so you can't see the letters.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, my fault. When we turn the lights off, you'll be able to see it. Otherwise, I can write it down somewhere. You can also Google it. You can find it, like ʻalae tracking project or something like that. But so we actually have there's like a tool on the website where you can go and it'll say, okay, which bands did you see? Where was it? And then you can enter that information to us. Otherwise, you're welcome to just send us pictures. I always correspond with people by email. My typical habit is if someone sends us information on a bird, I send them information on that bird back. And so I say, okay, well, we banded that bird at this time. This bird is its relative. This bird was who it was mated with. It had these kids, etc. So it's kind of neat. You can get kind of a background story on whatever bird you saw and learn a lot about them, which is neat. So